Burundi has closed its borders with Rwanda after accusing its neighbor of funding rebel attacks. The two countries are caught up in a diplomatic spat after Burundi accused Rwanda of backing the RED-Tabara, a DRC-based armed group. Last month, the group claimed responsibility for an attack near Burundi's western border. 20 people have lost their lives during the attacks. We are joined by Joseph Ochieno, writer and African affairs commentator. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What do we need to understand about where this comes from?
It's an unfortunate situation for the two countries, isn't it? But also a very unfortunate situation for East Africa. These are member states of the East African community who should really not be closing borders in between each other in this day and age. But that said, this is not new, the conflict between the two countries. It is the case that you might remember, or maybe people may now already be forgetting, that during those atrocious genocide in Rwanda, the precipitate for this was the bringing down of an aircraft that killed the then Rwandan President Habyarimana, and in fact, the Burundian President Ndadaye. So, but in this case, the Burundi's case, it is such that, anything to do with Rwanda and the threat in terms of the internal security is something which is taken absolutely emotively. As it happens, there's a rebel group, as you referred to, the RED-Tabara, who attacked installations in Burundi. But interestingly, some of the members of that group, if you like, escaped via Rwanda, quite conveniently, and back into DR Congo, as it has been alleged. Of course, Rwanda denies this, but it may be the case that we will confirm that the UN panel of experts themselves, not so long ago, confirmed that actually this grouping based in DR Congo are supported by Rwanda. That means, therefore, that the two countries really have not had very good relations, and more so recently when it was hoped that the new president of Burundi would possibly help to create a normalization of relations between the two countries. But that hasn't happened, particularly with this more recent rebel attack. Of course, as it were, Rwanda vehemently, almost certainly as usual, denies that.
Mm-hmm. And so you've got two countries that are accusing Rwanda of being, and these are their words, or one country's words, a bad neighbor. And so Rwanda has consistently denied this. If you listen to what people are saying in the region, or if you follow what people are saying in the region, is there any credence to this? Because what would Rwanda stand to gain?
I think that's a very important question. That's extremely tempting because in many cases Rwanda has successfully, and put fantastic PR, successfully presented themselves as the victims. In this case, perhaps the people whom people don't like. But you keep on wondering where every other time everyone else is complaining about you, there is no smoke without fire, as it were, that African are saying. But as it happens, these are two countries that are basically necessarily one identity, one nation, Rwanda and Burundi. Part of the underlying issue is the fact that Rwanda and Burundi are countries occupied by two major, without prejudice, African identities called Batusi and then Bahutu. In Burundi's case, the Bahutu are about 86% or thereabout the population. In Rwanda, meaning 14% Batusi, but they continue and have been dominating and ruling that country for a long time. Same case with Rwanda. What are we saying? These are basically two peoples basically cut off in between by borders. As it happens, I gave you a background of the 1994 events leading to the genocide. That quite clearly means that many people, and you give the nuances about this region, you can talk about DR Congo, you can talk about Uganda, you can even talk about Tanzania, cases where particular identity community are accused of not only wanting to dominate, but almost certainly in many cases the evidence, either seeking to support a particular rebellion or absolutely openly involved in supporting rebellion in this country, in this sub-region. So as it were, it is not something that anybody could necessarily dismiss, that the Tutsi in Rwanda, or Rwanda as a nation state, is a big accusation, a big allegation. Can be very tempting to say that, well, they can cleanse themselves on the question of allegations in Burundi, because I told you that actually the guys who launched the attack in Burundi escaped to Rwanda. Who are they? They're basically a Tutsi-led organization that are actually seeking to overthrow the government in Burundi. Same case, I think, as you seem to suggest, situation in Congo, a particular group, the Tutsi group in Congo, they're Congolese, by the way, wanting, if you like, to have their own identity nation state in that part of Congo. What is it? Many ordinary people in the streets, this is not my language from my professional point of view, many people believe that as an identity, this is a group that wants to, if you like, establish, if you like, an exclusive identity nation state within the sub-region, or if anything, in the very least, they want to influence the polity in Burundi, in Congo, in Uganda, and of course, effectively control that in Rwanda. In many cases, off the streets, in cafes, people want to say these things, and they say so sometimes without any reservations. Rather unfortunate this day and age anywhere on this continent.
Mr. Ochieno, the closing of a border between one country and another is not a non-event. It's quite big news. And so what is the immediate or the long-term threat presented by this, more so in that region? Already East Africa is feeling very uncomfortable because of what is happening, Somalia, Somaliland, Ethiopia, and then you've got this. What's going on?
Rwanda and Uganda had their borders closed for over 3 years. Rwanda and Congo is almost a matter of normalcy in terms of their conflicts, including accusations leading to the recent elections in Congo. We talk about Rwanda, a Burundi question. You're absolutely right. The instability in South Sudan, where Sudan and South Sudan and Uganda have been accusing one another, and where Uganda is absolutely involved in Somalia. Unfortunately, I want to say this, that actually in many cases in the last 30 years, the usual suspect will normally be Mr. Kagame or Mr. Museveni or both in many of these cases. That is very unfortunate. It's a factual reality. But I think the people in this region is really not about those personalities, nor is it about any of the specific nation states. I think some of us have argued that maybe the East African community, when it was being expanded, would possibly help to harmonize this, but you can't harmonize institutions when we have the strong men rather than strong foundations for institutions in this region. It would appear that the interests of individuals continue to, if you like, to overwhelm the question of leadership in our region. And so therefore we hope that with the recent elections in Congo, if it is confirmed that President Tshisekedi continues as president for the next 5 years, we hope that those may begin to become the emergent alternative new leaders for this sub-region, who will then be able to help, if you like, harmonize relations and make sure that citizens of this countries, citizens of this region are able to, if you like, return to normalcy like the new SADC that we see these days, where we're able to focus, if you like, on Pan-Africanism, as it were, in non-aligned movement, as it were, the broader African identity, including those of our brothers and sisters in Brazil, rather than talk about identities of 15% versus 85%, in which case we talk about one small group wanting to dominate the other, or indeed one big group wanting really to, if you like, to neutralize a group that they think are a minority.
To what end?
Well, as I said, individual and personal polity would normally mean that it's policy about personalities, about power, about resources, and in many cases it will always be, unfortunately in Africa, extended forces that have got interest in this continent, whether they're global powers or global individuals. In many cases, if you like, global mafias pushing for gold, pushing for control of particular areas, pushing for land. I think time is near, really, for this region, as a continent, actually, for this continent, for us to begin to stop beginning to have these conversations where neighboring countries want to, if you like, control the other, rather than seeking to invest in opportunities in which you're able to do what is very urgent for this continent. You guys are going towards elections. There's also topics that are going on, including the conversation you're having with the guests before, that this continent really wants our resources to be mobilized towards investment in education, investment in health, investment in public infrastructure, including, if you like, the bigger question of agriculture, investing in our peoples, including cross-border peoples, dismantling this business of passports and visas across the continent so that we're one united people, rather than talking talks of closing borders. But if I may say so, you seem to suggest much earlier why it is very likely the case that Burundi must have felt sufficiently threatened to seek to be able to close the borders, because at the end of the day, it's really the ordinary Burundi, ordinary Rwanda, ordinary border communities who basically in many cases not only trade with one another, but in many cases work across the borders. Not only do they work and trade across the borders, but many of them are relatives with the relatives at the other end of the neighboring country. So really the inconvenience is real to the majority of the ordinary African peoples, and I don't think this is the kind of conversation we should be having in 2024. Unfortunately, the strong men around this continent who are pushing individual interests, some of them are pushing dynasties, and in many cases they're pushing these dynasties in the interest of, of global powers and global forces that continue to sustain them. I think these are conversations that should be going to university rooms and halls of residences, and indeed actual public lectures, so that actually a new Africa that pushing tomorrow is one that reclaims Africa for Africans rather than Africa for individuals.
Mr. Ochieno, it's probably conversations that we are already hearing at the markets, at the taxi ranks in some parts of our continent, right, where the population is very much awake to what is happening, because you speak to some of the elderly people and they'll tell you about what they have lived to see again in the form of wars, in the form of what is now happening on the continent under a leadership that they thought was going to take them forward. And so we spoke to Human Rights Watch a little bit earlier on in the program, and they were bemoaning the selective condemnation when it comes to the violation of human rights, and how some African countries have been left out of the conversation, need only think of the DRC. And so she spoke, and that would be Letitia Bader, the Deputy Director for Africa of Human Rights Watch, about action needing to be taken. And so you speak to people on the ground and you ask them what action actually needs to be taken. What are you hearing?
I think that had suggested some of these things as nuances. I mean, those of us who've been around, we look back to 30 years ago when sometimes we're losing our voices talking about struggles in Southern Africa, struggles actually within this East Africa region. I told you about the two strong men within this sub-region who are basically Anglo-American instructors. You could bang the doors and heads of rooms and in the West and talk about human rights records and human rights abuse in Uganda and Rwanda, the records of these leaders, Museveni and Kagame and others. And they were presented as the new breed of African leaders who actually net solutions to this continent. That's part of the problem. Many of these guys have now been so used to being the leading structures that human rights of the ordinary Africans neither here nor there. But it's also the case, you're right, that many of us as Africans, including, and these days I challenge, including some of the senior professors who 30 years ago would tell them that we told you so. People seemed to agree with Ochieno because Ochieno looks like them or they come from the neighboring villages. People used to agree with Mangosuthu because Mangosuthu is related to my friend's sister, something along those lines. Very simplistic, actually, but these things actually did happen. While at the time we were simply saying to us that let's go towards a post-apartheid, post-colonization Africa in which there's democracy, a post-apartheid Africa in which institutions do exist, a situation in which we're able to elect leaders on the basis of their merit rather than the sub-region that they come from, a situation in which actually if there's a leader threatening their communities, there's no silence in Pretoria simply because we don't want to say no to you guy in Kampala. Well, for that I give credit to President Ramaphosa and the people of South Africa for the courage they took on the position of the question of Israel, I must say. But I'm saying that those are the kind of things that actually are needed on this continent. We need a strong guy, a strong lady who's able to bang the table and simply say that no, not anymore in Africa. That's what I'm trying to say. This conversation needs to begin to be led. I don't think it should be led by Human Rights Watch. That's fair enough and good enough. I've got the experience of that. I think there's a conversation that should start in Pretoria. They should start at the AU. They should start at NAM, non-aligned movement, summits around Kampala, and wherever these things are taking place. But leadership needs to emerge in Africa. African leaders need to be able to say no and be able to call out their brethren. In most cases, they've not done so. And so we now have spoiled men, the all predominant men, spoiled men in charge of some of the situations, and the citizens are poor, weak. DR Congo is a fantastic example. When those days, as recent as 20 years ago, in fact, possibly 15 years ago, I know when I was elsewhere, we would basically be looking for Congolese who had the capacity and the energy to join hands to expose whatever was happening in their countries. In many cases, those things, those were not possible. Why? Because Congo had been substantially forgotten. But can you imagine? That is the richest of the rich African nation, and where children and women were being raped and abused, including, in complicity with some of the global organizations, and in many cases where some of the leaders of the regions within the neighborhood were involved, but global agencies like the UN were prepared and willing to say no or to look the other side. This continent, I think, has suffered sufficiently.
Mr. Ochieno, you mentioned the African Union and you speak of democracy. One day we'll hopefully talk about how democracy has worked for Africa. But the African Union, to your assessment, what has disallowed the African Union from being the strongman or the strongwoman that you speak of?
I think it was basically just taken over by men of convenience, particularly predominantly men of convenience. Following the neoliberal agenda of the early 90s, I think the Bretton Woods institutions and the global north were quite willing to have, if you like, head men, or Dr. Botis called them nyampalas, meaning like equivalent class monitors on the continent who would say yes, yes on their interests. Now, these guys would actually serve their geopolitical interests. In this case, would actually try to make sure that they break down and dismantle public assets in their countries and in this sub-region and open up markets in the interest of excess capital from the West. That is what happened. That is how, particularly in South Africa, it's interesting. I'm still hearing your Minister of Education still talk about some of those things. In some of the countries, the public health is dead. Public education is dead. Even infrastructure, public infrastructure is public transport. You talk about people's private buses, and in others, the state outsourced its role to private sector, and private sector substantially controlled by the rest of the world. While that was happening at the time, I remember there was once upon a time when if a Zambian minister, and I'm saying this guy, the Zambian minister, is going to have a conversation with IMF and World Bank, they would be told that you need to behave like so and so. In this case, possibly behave like Mr. Museveni if you want us to give you money. That is really what happened. These things got them entrenched and African leaders lost. The African Union, meaning the Organization for African Unity, that were founded in the 60s, that was rolled around genuine African liberation. I miss those ones. The leaders all the time, I miss those leaders. While people actually say that these were old generation and we now have a new generation of leaders, I genuinely think that not many of our leaders today are genuinely committed to this continent, and not many of them are genuinely interested in the future of the African children and grandchildren of today as the leaders, the founding leaders of the Organization of African Unity, where the African Union still has a possibility. I hope the current leadership, one or two of them, may emerge to speak the language that you and I are speaking. Okay.
We have many leaders who are yet to assume the position that are interested in exactly that kind of agenda. Thank you very much, Joseph Ochieno. He's a writer and African affairs commentator. More news for you in a few moments.